Chapter 8, The Joint Forces. Ion Noto. I looked at the tall mountains and grinned at my men. This is Mount Anale, do you know that? I told the soldier beside me. He was an excellent swordsman, but I sorely missed Rhodora's presence. I should not have sent her elsewhere. The Grey Men attacked the Kanelan Palace almost a moon turn ago, but nothing had been done about it since then. The Emperor did not even ask us to scout the ghost town or never asked us to find out who the Grey Men were. That is, until last week. He commanded me to take charge of the south. To scare the Akeans here. To ensure that they submit to the Emperor, again. And again. And again. He also instructed me to find the boy, Kino Amark, whatever it took. Dead or alive, it did not really matter. It was only out of pride that I still yearned to bring the boy alive to the Emperor. And now, this. The Emperor sent me a missive informing me that the Grey Men were, in fact, Nivens. He said he was not as sure, but since my men were going south, I reckon they should take the route that led us straight to the heart of Nivedan, and do what needs to be done there. I wondered if all of this was true, though. Nivens, ghosts, Grey Men? Were they really referring to the same Akeans? And yet, somehow, it seemed to make sense. I mean, there really could be no other explanation for the Grey Men. They vanished into thin air and had attacked the guards at the palace. Twice I have fought them, and twice I have failed. The thought twisted in my gut. I needed to have my revenge, to avenge the deaths of the men who fought alongside me in Sinista. If it were true that the Grey Men were the ghosts of Nivedan, and if they were all but flesh instead of what Akeans think, then I swear by my soldiers' graves that I would eradicate their clan in vengeance. I could feel my heart racing in anticipation. It was the chill that I welcomed the most, the anxiety that I felt right before any battle. Let's ride! I shouted to my men as I trotted ahead towards the foothills of Mount Anale. Jor Pasap. My men and I were weary from travel. For us to learn that the ghost town was not as welcoming was disheartening, to think that we risked leaving our horses at the province's boundaries. Maurice was now busily packing the tent that we used last night. We've stayed here long enough. If the ghosts do not welcome us here, I expect their wrath will be upon us soon. He shook his head. I don't want that to happen while we're still here. Sonnet has instructed all the men to leave Nivedan, I added. But where do we go from here? This sounded like a perfect place for us to hide. Now that we are certain that ghosts abound here, isn't it all the more worth it to remain here? What do you think? Do you reckon we can convince Sonnet? Maurice asked, still packing. That made sense, except how sure could we be that if there were others to come here, the ghosts would pick our group to side with? What if it were the other way around and the spirits sided with the newcomers? Awful. Just awful. I shook my head at Maurice and picked up my pack. Best to start traveling again. Perhaps we should try Karsthea? Now that the ghost town is off the list, then maybe it should be our next destination, I said, leaving our pitching site. Perhaps it was time to see what had become of the former Queen of Amer. I could hear Maurice's footsteps trailing behind me. From a short distance, I could see Sonnet. Some men flanked him, and they were having quite a discussion. It is not to be done anymore. I told you, didn't you hear the Lady Ghost? She didn't want us here. What part of that was difficult to understand? Sonnet bellowed. Then, he frowned at the surrounding soldiers. When he saw me, he waved at me. He motioned for us to join the discourse. Tell them what happened. Sonnet said, almost at the top of his voice. I've told them 100 times already, I said. We must leave this place. The ghosts will haunt us if we do not leave. But the ghosts sounded like Akeans. Of course, they sounded like Akeans. Sonnet bellowed again. What are ghosts? Weren't they people once? It's just that now they're dead. The rebels flushed. But Chief, if we leave, we risk running into the Emperor's men and the Tree Runners. The Tree Runners are gentle creatures, Sonnet argued, but he was cut off. They used to be gentle creatures before the Emperor freed them from the curse that banished them to Sinista. Have you heard about what they've been doing all around Akea? One of the men bellowed. When Sonnet eyed the rebel angrily, he stopped talking. It doesn't matter if there were tree runners around, and we meet the Emperor's men along the roads. We will fight them if we need to. At least, we can still avoid them if we must, Sonnet said. I wondered how he could have said all of that without his voice breaking, as though he believed there was a chance we could win a fight against the Emperor's men in case we ran into them. Why would the Emperor's men want anything to do with us anyway? We don't look like bandits. We're just a harmless group of men on a trip, Sonnet said. Exactly. That's what we are, another rebel said. A group. It doesn't look as though we are on a mission to praise the moons either. Look at everyone. Does at least one of us look meek? If the Emperor's men come across us, they would kill us on the spot. They wouldn't think twice. The Emperor's instructions to his men were clear, didn't you hear the news? Teach every dissenting body a lesson. And a lesson we will definitely get. I couldn't blame the men. Their concerns were real. Calm down, I said. We must not let anything get in between us. We are already a faction, the one that dissented from the palace. We must remain united if we want to stand a chance going against the palace. Sonnet looked as though he wanted to thump me in the head for speaking before he could open his mouth to retort to the rebel. Chief, if I may, I agree with you. If the ghosts do not want us here, we should leave and find a different hiding place for all of us, I said. Sonnet nodded vigorously. It's not a matter for discussion anymore. If anybody here doesn't agree with me. I raised my hand to stop him from what he was about to say. Chief, there's no more discussion needed. We must leave. It's still a long journey towards Karasthea, so we must leave now, I said. Sonnet grunted before turning around and shouting, "Follow me." I turned to Maurice. That's not the right way, I said. Maurice shrugged his shoulders. Weren't you listening? He said no more discussion. Let's just follow him. I wonder how long it would take him before he realizes that he's taken the wrong direction. He chuckled. We are going to waste even more time, I insisted. This is the only time we'll be here in Ghost Town. Who knows what kind of treasure we might find here? Look, I'm not a fan of ghosts. I am terrified. But the sun is shining brightly, and nothing can hurt us. Let's just teach the chief a lesson or two about pride. The moons know he needs one, Maurice said. I had to agree. All right. It's going to be a very tiring lesson. I hope he learns what you want him to learn sooner. Trust me. He will be able to lead this group better if he learns this lesson well, Maurice said. The rebels had started moving by now, following Sonnet's lead. They were carrying their packs, some of them looking more warily at their surroundings, while others hid their fear by humming old folk songs as though enjoying the morning hike. Look at them go, Maurice said. I don't think any of them realize that Sonnet is leading us towards the heart of Niveden instead of away from it. Maurice exhaled in resignation. This bunch is really hopeless. Why don't you take the lead? What? And miss all the fun? I said. Leave Sonnet be. I wonder how he ever made this throng of rebels follow him in the first place. Sonnet's large frame swayed as he kept on walking. He raised a hand and scratched his armpit. Definitely not because of charisma, I said. Maurice chuckled, shaking his head. No. I'm sure that's not it. But I wonder how he became chief of the rebels, every waking moment. Elder Mayandilo. I have never seen them act like this before. When Nivens went on a rescue mission to retrieve Jaras's body, they had assembled but not to fight. It was different now. Everywhere I looked, I could see some trace of fortification. As Salvatore instructed, Nivens were now manning every possible entry point to Niveden. It would have been a solid strategy except that all were also told not to touch any intruder, only to watch out for their movements. Nivens hoped that intruders would just carry on without causing much damage to Niveden. And now, there were two sets of intruders. One was the rebel group, while the other was composed of the Emperor's men and tree runners. The rebels were an easy group to handle. But when one of the Nivens spotted the Emperor's men and tree runners approaching Nivedon, it stirred the elder Nivens. The scouts said something about the tree runners, like they were not supposed to fight, not supposed to side with anyone, and so hope blossomed in everyone's chest that whatever threat this second group posed, it too shall pass. I stood beside Laren since she still offered me protection by making me invisible. We climbed the highest tree in all of Nivedon because it could offer us a good vantage point and view. From the north, I could hear hooves, still faint. But with the passing of each hour, it was bound to get louder to announce the arrival of the Emperor's men. Elder Mayan, Laren spoke. They've come too soon. I thought we had more months to prepare for this. It was true. The Nivens' only power was invisibility. While they could hide, and invisibility could still provide them some protection when it came to offensive fighting, their power gave them only a slight advantage. At this moment, what was I to tell Laren to make her faith grow? Romeo had been training the Nivens. They are good fighters now. They may not be a match to the Emperor's men, but as they can cloak themselves, there is a chance that we would not only give the Emperor's men a hard time but hopefully drive them away from Nivedon. There was some rustling from behind us, and a man appeared. It was Salvatore. No one must fight this second group of intruders. Romeo would make sure of that. Not unless I give the word, Salvatore said. A wise decision, Chief Hunter, I said. If we can avoid bloodshed, it would serve us well. We must not make hasty decisions. Our number must not be diminished out of these false threats. Salvatore shook his head. Sadly, the tree runners give us reason to worry. Laren became visible. She was frowning, and her forehead had creased. Since her husband died, her age had begun to show on her face. It was odd that when she learned Pyper had run away with Dogan for the second time, she seemed relieved somehow. Tree runners are gentle creatures. Yes, yes. Gentle creatures indeed. Salvatore cut in. But they have allied with the Emperor. They are not as gentle anymore as one might think. The only reason they came into existence is that the first of the tree runners betrayed his lover by stealing the last dragon's egg. It was part of their clan's curse because the last dragon's egg must be protected. If the Emperor had allied with them, our clan would think they had offered the egg to the Emperor. And if there's only one dragon left, then how would the other provinces stand against Canela? Fear of a dragon, of a mighty creature that flies and obliterates everything into cinders, can cause a man to lose faith, he said. As long as we don't fight them, they would just pass Nivedon. Salvatore laughed sarcastically. This second group is not like the first one. It's a curse that there should be so many of them now so they could protect the dragon's egg. But if we remain quiet and invisible to them, they won't know about us. Just like the other intruders from the past, I said. Salvatore shook his head. Laren looked at me, wanting to say something, but it was Salvatore who spoke. A long time ago, when the Nivens had yet to be driven into hiding, back when the tree runners had yet to be banished into Sinista, they worked closely together. The tree runners reared the trees and were the ones who helped us identify which trees to pick out to build our tree houses. They were once our partners, and we had developed a particular affinity with them. Before the Emperor's men came into view, one of the Nivens had already come running to tell us that the second batch of intruders was approaching. I asked him how he knew, and he could not give me any specific answer. I had some concerns and a hunch of who this group could have been. Nivens can feel the tree runners' presence, as they are with us. Being invisible only affords us little protection. They would know we are here, Salvatore said. I felt the blood draining from my face. If this were true, then we could be facing catastrophic repercussions. You should have kept their animals at bay the way you did with the other rebels, Salvatore said. It didn't work with the rebels. They are still on their way to the heart of Nivedon. If I did the same to the Emperor's men, it would have had the same effect on them. They would only want to get closer, I replied. There seemed to be no way out of this. I shook my head slowly, pondering other options. It seems our luck may have run out, Laren finally said. Then, as an afterthought, she added, It was a good thing that I let Pyper run away with Dogan. Laren turned to face me. Don't be surprised, Elder. I know how my daughter's mind works. I also know she wouldn't remain here when she thinks she should be out there saving the world. I didn't call her attention to it or bother to stop her. I made her think that she was disobeying me. And because that's what she believes to be true, she would find herself always drawn back to me to make amends. She will always come back to me. I gazed at Laren long and hard. One could never really fathom the way a mother's mind works. She was brilliant. We looked ahead at where we were expected the second batch of intruders to come from. She is safe, for now, I said, stealing a quick glance at Laren. I received word from a bird that Dogan and Pyper have safely arrived in Canela. I didn't know how long they would remain safe, but for now this was some assurance I could give Laren. Laren's eyes moistened. She nodded slightly to acknowledge that she heard what I said. If the intruders conquer Nivedan today, I would rest easy knowing Pyper is safe. Thank you, Elder Mayan, Laren said. Nivedan will not succumb to usurpers, Salvatore said from behind us. Let us hope for the best. My husband died trying to protect our clan. I will not let his death go to waste. We will fight if we must, Laren said. I closed my eyes and called out to my friends. If this was our last stand against the Emperor's men, I would prove to the Nivens that I would not falter in my allegiance to them. Ion Noto. We rode towards Ghost Town, and as we arrived at the clearing, the eerie silence of the province greeted us. I was unsure if it was because we knew that this place was Ghost Town or if the eeriness of it all was too surreal to deny. I raised my hand to halt the troops, and everyone heeded. My men surveyed the place for any sign of life, but not even the birds stirred. It was as though the town completely fell still when we reached its center. What do you expect to find here, Your Grace? Lou, my second in command, asked. The ones that we fought not so long ago in the Kanelan Palace when the war dogs went crazy and bit the Emperor by the neck. Do you remember them? The Grey Men. I was informed that they could be the Nivens or the ghosts of Nivedan, I said calmly. My eyes were still wandering about, taking in everything about the ghost town. Again, nothing stirred. Lou followed my gaze. It is ironic. This place thrives bountifully, yet no one here seems to be left breathing. Why would you suspect the Grey Men and the ghosts were one and the same? I decided to ignore his question and trotted over to where the tree runners were huddled. I still wondered what made the Emperor do what he did, releasing these tree runners from Sinista. They deserved to be imprisoned there. You! I said, pointing to one of the tree runners, who seemed to be the oldest among them. It was challenging to put an age to their faces, especially with their skin's dark brown and coarse texture. The tree runner stood up and walked over to me. He was so tall that I had to look up. What's your name? I asked. Rimalo, he said blankly. There doesn't seem to be anything here. I need your lot to bring down the tree houses, I said. Rimalo looked up at the tree houses that were settled on the canopies. There were many houses, and rope bridges connected the homes, making it seem like an entire community still lived here. And while the place did not stir, it seemed off to me that the surroundings were quite kempt. How this was possible, I was unsure. Unless, of course, ghosts really live here, and for whatever reason, they could maintain the upkeep of this place. Rimalo looked as though he was reluctant to obey me. He glanced at the other tree runners, looking anxious to tell them something. That's why you're with us, I said. Because your bulk gives you strength, and your strength is something that we can use to ensure that whatever the Emperor commands, we deliver. So stop looking at your lot, seeking their approval. Whatever I say on behalf of the Emperor, so obey me, I tell you. Lou was standing beside me. Let's shoot arrows up in the air. Make arrows rain. I know ghosts won't feel the arrows, but if the Emperor's hunch, that the Grey Men reside here, is true, an arrow would most likely hit at least one of them. I raised my right hand to dismiss him. I've tried that before. I know that tactic. You don't have to tell me how to command these men, I said. I sorely wished that Rhodora was the one with me. She wouldn't have behaved as though she were better than I. This Lou was making my blood boil with his simple suggestions. Regardless, it did make sense. Lou, there's something that I need you to do. Lou turned to look at me, waiting for my instructions. Tell everyone that we will stay here for the night. The men are tired. Tell them to set up camp or occupy these tree houses, whatever they prefer. But in the morning, we must be ready to leave. In the meantime, tell them that they are also free to destroy whatever they wish. Just leave me somewhere I can spend the night, I said. Destroy the place? Lou asked. Yes, I said nonchalantly. That's what the Emperor wants. Make sure that wherever we go, we leave a mark that no one is safe unless they are under the protection of the Kanelan Palace. Nivedon, being Ghost Town, would be made an example. Destroy everything. All right then. I will make sure it is done. I will involve the tree runners, Lou said. After he left, I decided to survey the area further. It was too quiet here. Too peaceful. Something is amiss. But what? I remembered the stories the other soldiers told about how they could clearly hear baby ghosts crying when they passed by the ghost town. The younger me believed in those stories, they excited me. I had always wanted to visit Nivedon, but now that I am here, I think I would have wanted some action. Disappointment, though, is what I actually got. There were no ghosts. No signs of gray men. No animals, even. I stopped in front of a massive tree that supported a huge treehouse. Most houses were almost the same size, but this one was by far the biggest. This would be my home for tonight. I climbed up effortlessly. After a few moments, I was already on the landing of the treehouse. I touched the railing with my bare hands and examined it, surprised that there was no dust. There were some specks, but the treehouse would have been dirty regardless of weather conditions if the place had not been inhabited for a long time. It was just odd that this house, perhaps all the rest of them, were clean. When I pushed the door ajar and entered the treehouse, it seemed like it was lived in by Akeens. Ghosts or gray men, whatever. However, I could be wrong. And yet, this place was just too livable. I entered quickly, my suspicions arising. I proceeded to what seemed like the kitchen, and true enough, some scent of food still wafted in the air. Something minty must have been cooked here. Its scent still leaving traces in the kitchen air. Investigating further, I found containers filled with water on one of the countertops. I took one, opened it, and inspected the water. It was clear, not tepid as one would expect. I drank it. Why was I not surprised that it was fresh as though it was recently fetched from a spring? My heart pounded. This could be a trap. But if it were, where were they? Where were the gray men? Unless, just like what they did in the Kanelan Palace, they were cloaked in invisibility. Unknowingly, I dropped the water container onto the wooden floor. It smashed into pieces, but it didn't matter to me. I wandered inside the house, kicking each door open, expecting that someone would jump at me any moment, but there was still nothing. No one. I stopped in one of the rooms and felt the bed. It was still warm, as though someone had just risen from slumber. It's a trap. I sprinted back to the main door and looked down at my men. They were already dispersed, some were setting up their tents already, while others were busy talking. Others were just lying on the ground, resting. It's a trap. I shouted. They're here. I don't know where, but be ready on your toes. Soldiers, assemble. As I said these, I jumped down from the treehouse. Lou trotted his horse towards me, holding the reins of my horse, which I quickly took. I mounted my bay and galloped away. Move back. Move back. I shouted. Everyone had been alerted by now and were mounting their horses. We don't know where they are. Lou was behind me. General, if we have no idea where they are, let us release some arrows. I nodded firmly. Give the order, I said, keeping a careful watch of what was in front of me. Where are they? Where are they hiding? Elder Mayandilo. It was difficult to hide one's presence, even if one could turn invisible, all traces of living were still there. There were too many of them, and the tree runners were with the Emperor's men. Even while the Nivens hid, the tree runners could feel them out. They sense us, Salvatore muttered from behind me. There's no way but to fight them now. We will lose our people if we do, I said, although I shared his sentiment. Do we stand a chance? Laren asked. I could feel her hand tensing as she held mine to keep me invisible. We have a better chance if we send the women and children away first. They might still be able to escape as long as they remain quiet, Salvatore said. I should have given them the signal to leave hours ago. There's no sense overthinking about these now. They wouldn't go anyway, I said. Your clan, its people are too honorable to run away from a fight. Especially if it meant defending your heritage, I said. Then, we fight. It seems like it's the only way to go about this, Laren said gravely. Elder, we will need your friends. They are ready? All right, Salvatore said. Take charge of your task. I would go and see what Romeo is up to. When the signal is sent, we fight, the chief hunter said sternly. He left Laren and me as we hid amongst the trees, waiting, watching what the outsiders would do next. Ion Noto. Arrows. Lou yelled. At the count of 3, release them. The archers surrounding me had their arms stretched, knocking arrows to their bows and holding their positions, waiting for the instruction to let go. The arrows were at an angle that would shoot down about 300 meters beyond our perimeter. Release! Lou shouted. The slew of arrows pierced the air. It was followed by the thudding sound of arrowheads penetrating tree trunks, the ground, rocks, everywhere. I looked at Lou and raised my hand. 3 times, I said, to which Lou nodded. Again. He shouted. Draw. And release. The soldiers repeated the act 3 times and lowered their bows when it was done. Time to search, Lou said, instructing the men and rallying them. I moved forward, too, searching for any sign of the gray men. They might be able to move things and put on a ghostly show, but they will never be able to warm a bed. That was what I found upstairs in the treehouse that I visited. The men were moving about, retrieving their arrows, and carefully scouring the surroundings. There seemed to be no one here, but I could not be mistaken. The desire to capture the gray men and seek revenge for the men I had lost in Sinista was burning me up from the inside. And once I get a hold of them, they would face my wrath first. Whoever survives would then be brought to the Emperor. If, and only if, any would survive. Jor Pasap. I stared at the sky, waiting for more displays of the arrows. We were a reasonable distance away from where the first batch of arrows fell upon, but the second batch of bolts was too close. By the third batch, we had to scurry away to avoid getting hit. Unfortunately, not all of us were able to make it to safety. Will he make it? I asked. One of the men lay on the ground, an arrow piercing his chest. He was squirming, but Maurice's sturdy hands clutched and kept him in place. Maurice looked at me and shook his head. There's no way we can remove it without tearing his heart all the more, he said in a mournful voice. Sonnet came bustling from our back. What the cratty hell was that? He asked. His eyes had bulged in surprise, and as he stared at the dying comrade in front of us, his face contorted in rage. Whoever did this will pay. Those ghosts dare attack us? He said in a loud voice. I doubt if ghosts would resort to releasing arrows. Besides, we made peace with them and agreed that we would no longer stay in this place, I said. But this is something that's even more dangerous. By avoiding the Emperor's forces from the south, we might just have come across one that was coming from the north, I said. Maurice tightened his grip on the man whose body now spasmed. The man let out a wail before his body went limp. Maurice stood up, backing away. His hands were dripping in blood. He's gone, he muttered. Are there any other casualties? The others shook their heads. Their faces were all scared, probably imagining that this dead body could have been theirs. They will not get away with this, whoever they are. Sonnet said threateningly. That's not how we should go about it. We must skirt away from this place and leave stealthily. These men are not ready, Sonnet, I argued. They are trained to fight. Sonnet yelled at me, his spittle spraying all over my face. It is not important if they do not know how to fight well. What's important is that they know how to fight. Sonnet bent, panting, as though having to shout had taken an awful lot of energy from him. I shook my head. It doesn't make any sense. Why are we going to engage in this? They haven't found us yet. Let's bury the body and be on our way. Save our lives, I said, pointing to everyone. Sonnet's eyes narrowed at me. He repeatedly pushed a forefinger to my chest as he said, save their lives or save your ass? What are you scared of, Jor? Are you too old to fight? Bah. Then leave. I don't need cowards in my group. Go. Save yourself. I ground my teeth in annoyance, and then when I was about to punch him, Maurice gripped my arms. Don't, he said. It's not worth it. You are not making sense. Why did we avoid the other troop if now that we encounter another one, we're going to engage with them when logic deduces that we'll never win against them in the first place? I yelled at Sonnet. We avenge the dead. He yelled back. Then, suddenly, there were loud footsteps from behind us. We turned around and saw, to our astonishment, the Emperor's men with their swords drawn out and their bows and arrows aimed at us. Their group parted in the middle, and a war general came trotting forward. He stared at us for a long time before laughing. This is all that we have? He said. Kill them, and we shall continue our search for the Grey Men. Elder Mayandilo. How fast? I asked. Information was flowing from one barricade to the others at high speed. There were no reported casualties from the other groups. The danger is still imminent, though, and we must stay hidden, Laren said. I don't understand. It appears they were already convinced that there was no one here, and suddenly, the war general gave the instructions to let it rain arrows. There must be something that triggered him, I said, although I could not exactly give any reason. I stopped, my heart still racing in anticipation of a war about to break loose. The gooey figure stood in front of us before it became visible, revealing Romeo. They found the other group, the first batch of rebels that wanted to hide and stay here in the province, he said in a rush. They said that they would be leaving. Laren paused as though she was shocked by this. We scared them enough. They will be slaughtered, and I don't know. Can we just let them die there? It doesn't seem right. We must help them. No. Romeo said. This is their fight. We drove them out of Nivedon. It wasn't our fault that the Emperor's men caught them here. Besides, this could pose as a good distraction. Laren revealed herself. Her cheeks were red, and her eyes narrowed in anger. She stared at Romeo intently before slapping him across the cheek. If you don't change and remain as hardened with your cold heart, you will never be fit to be chief one day. You will never replace Salvatore? Laren said. Romeo sneered at her. Laren raised her hand again to strike, but this time, Romeo caught her hand and gripped it tightly before forcing it down. I am protecting our people. I am the one who wants to ensure that this clan is not going to fall into pieces, he growled. Show compassion to those men, and let's see how many more Nivens will die. Never mind that if we remain hidden, no one would be lost. Never mind that. Say it to my face if that is not a better decision. I will talk to Salvatore. He is the chief hunter now, and he will decide if we will join this war or not, Laren said. Romeo threw his arms in annoyance. Send the Nivens to their deaths if that is your wish. I will make sure they know who risked their lives. He then turned around and vanished into thin air. Laren was shaking. I reached out to touch her shoulder. Am I wrong to be compassionate, Elder? she asked. I say we save who we can. War knows no race, no clan. When we fight as one, Akene's one and all. Now we side with whom we believe is fighting for the common good, I said. Laren nodded grimly. Then, we fight. I will search for my uncle, she said. From where we were, we could see most of the Emperor's men heading southward toward the rebels. The fight had yet to start, and it seemed there was still hope of dispersing them. Then all at once, the Emperor's men surged forward, swords raised and aimed at knocking the rebels dead. Everyone could hear the screaming that came afterward. Jor Pasap. I drew out my sword and prepared to fight. Maurice stood ready by my side. The rest of the troop scampered about. I looked behind me, heart racing. It was precisely how I pictured my last day would be in this world, very much alive, fighting for my life, fighting for a cause I believe in. And when the time comes that a sword would end my life, I would somehow be rid of the guilty feelings that still burdened me to that very moment. Where were the children that I fathered? What has become of them? I have abandoned them and in doing so, perhaps contributed to how they turned out now. Good or bad, it didn't matter. I still hold myself accountable for whatever shortcomings they had in their lives. I prayed that death would take me swiftly, although I have no fear of physical pain. What was not welcome was remembering the past mistakes that I made. No. There's certainly no more room for that. The first soldier came at me. Before he could strike, I moved quickly to my left and parried before thrusting my sword into his body. The blade went straight through his stomach. The soldier's eyes widened in shock, but before I could see whatever pain he was feeling, I quickly withdrew my sword from his body, and he slumped to the ground, lifeless. There were too many soldiers rushing about. I had no time to spar with one, so without looking back, I rallied forward, meeting each sword that was trying to hit me with equal ardor. The fact that we were fewer than the Emperor's men fired me up and awakened a fierceness that I thought had been quenched long ago. I swung, and another soldier fell from his horse. I looked behind me to find another soldier who was about to hit me with a staff, but before he could do so, I caught sight of Maurice as he swung his blade at the soldier. The body fell with a loud thud. I nodded thanks to Maurice and took to fighting once more. There were so many of them, and everyone was out to kill us. There was no sympathy in their eyes, but then again, it is foolish to act as though you have a heart in war. Remembering this, I parried against 3 soldiers at once. All of them lay dead in a matter of moments. I am proud that I was still fierce in battle, that much I could say. But there were so many of them, and if 2 were slain, 3 or more replaced them. I now found myself surrounded by more men than I could ever fight against at once. Screams filled the air. There were desperate cries of men who wanted nothing to do with the war. The rebels' numbers, our numbers, were dwindling slowly. If this were how we were to fight, we would all end up dead in this carnage in about an hour. One soldier approached me, and although I had backed away quickly, the tip of his sword still came to contact with my chest. Blood gushed out and stained my shirt. I retaliated and thrust forward, ignoring the pain that quickly spread across my chest and hit the soldier just below his chin. I thrust forward a little more and heard his bones cracking as my sword found his neck. He fell lifeless on the ground, blood spurting from below his chin. I did not get to rest as another sword swung against me repeatedly. I raised my sword to block it, but I wasn't quick enough. So, I fell to the ground, arms still raised over my head. The soldier moved forward and swung hard at me, but I blocked it. At this point, I wondered again why Sonnet became the leader of this weak rebellion. Why would the rebels choose him? Why choose someone who had not displayed any fierceness in him, any skill in fighting? Why him? I kicked at my assailant, and luckily, he lost his foothold and slipped. Blood was everywhere, and it made the ground slippery. Before he could get up, I was back on my feet and planted my sword just between his ribs. He gave one last cry, but the sound on his lips vanished immediately as his soul left him. The other soldiers surrounding me earlier had gone on to fight the other rebels. I looked around and found Maurice already lying on the ground. An axe was jutting out of his stomach. Sweat coursed down my face and body, and there seemed to be no way to win this war. It was a slaughter, and there was no other way that this battle could end. For a change, I shouted, raising my sword. For changing what is right now. I would fight for a new beginning. A new emperor behind the Kanelan palace. The fighting did not stop. It was as though nobody heard my wails, but somehow, I felt the rebels gaining some strength, and after a while, some voices echoed what I shouted. To change. To a new beginning. Came some of the voices. A tear slid down my cheek as I mourned Maurice quietly. I had to fight, keep fighting, to avenge his untimely death. However, death to us old men was like a lover's call. It beckoned. And so, I just kept on fighting, waiting for the time that it would be my time to meet the ancestors. For a brief moment, I envied Maurice. Then, from a distance, I saw Sonnet. He was riding his horse, and he was surrounded by the rebels. His arm was raised as he held a sword. Fight! He shouted. Fight! Do not let the oppressors take you down. And then, suddenly, it was as though there was an energy that permeated my being. My sore muscles did not seem to bother me anymore. The wound that was throbbing in my chest seemed bearable. And all I had inside of me was courage. I stood up, and this time, there was no fear inside of me. My heart was still racing, but it was in anticipation of killing and fighting those that wanted to end our lives. I swung my sword faster, and more soldiers fell to the ground. The rebels around me, the ones scurrying away when the battle started, seemed to have been deserted by their own fears. They were fighting alongside me, and even though they were not as good at wielding the sword, their courage shone, and they defeated the soldiers around them. In a moment, we were gaining momentum. We moved forward, pushed our enemies behind and drove them back inside the ghost town. Fight! Never waver! Sonnet shouted. His face was covered with blood, and his sword dripped with soldiers' blood. He was, at the moment, a monument so fierce that I hoped curdled the enemy's blood. Ion Noto. I couldn't believe what was happening. As I stood behind the lines, I was confident that my men would be able to turn this place into a slaughterhouse in no time at all. But suddenly, my men were scampering about, fearful of their lives. I searched for Lou and saw him giving orders to the archers. Release! He shouted. Arrows rose in the air and rained upon the savages. Rebels fell, clutching at the arrows that hit their bodies. And yet, to my surprise, they tore at the arrows that jutted out of their bodies and stood again, welcoming the fight, some, not even bothering to remove the arrows at all. Lou shouted again, Release! Arrows fell torrentially upon the rebels, but only those that died upon being hit stopped fighting. Their courage was incredible. I never thought that I would need the tree runners in this battle, but it seemed like that is what I needed to do to save my men from perishing right before my eyes. So, I rode towards the tree runners to rally them to the fight. Jor Pasap. It didn't seem that we could even be at par with the Emperor's men, but as the battle unfolded, the odds swayed gently to our favor. I swung my sword again, and one soldier fell. Then, two came running toward me, and I danced to the side, thrusting my sword at the soldier to my left. He was able to avoid it. He parried against me, but this feeling of courage left me fearless, so instead of avoiding his sword, I struck against it and pushed against him. He slipped, and that millisecond when he lost balance gave me the advantage I needed, and I pierced him with my sword. I turned around in time to see another sword flying toward my neck. I blocked it and pushed back, then withdrew my sword and swung fully, but my opponent was able to block it all the same. He advanced toward me, meeting my strike with an equally strong blow. But before I could be on the offensive, a rebel had put a dagger into my opponent's back. I stood up, looking around. It appears we were now on equal footing. The Emperor's men no longer outnumbered us. Sonnet was still rallying the rebels. We all ran forward, chasing the Emperor's men even though arrows had fallen upon us like rain. Another wave of arrows swooshed upon us. This time, it was difficult to avoid them. And then, to my surprise, tall men with very dark skin came into view. They moved slowly as though their joints were hardened, but when they swung their arms and hit the rebels, they flew. There were many of them. Tree runners. Sonnet shouted. They are fighting for the Emperor now. Do not be afraid. Fight. We moved forward, but the tree runners were too strong, too many, for us. I stood in front of a tree runner, and while I undermined his speed, I was quick to regret it when my sword thudded bluntly upon hitting the tree runner's body. I stared in horror. How does one kill a tree runner? Before I could decide, the tree runner lunged forward, and his long arms hit me on my stomach and flung me away. I rose in the air as though I bore no weight and ended up several yards away from where I was standing just a moment ago. I moved to stand up but found it too difficult. It occurred to me that I may have broken some bones. I grunted as I tried to stand and stop myself from yelling in pain. There was only one thing on my mind, that I would somehow right some of my wrongs as I stood there fighting for what I believed was right. No more running away from responsibilities. There were soldiers and tree runners to fight now. While the tree runners were slow in coming, the soldiers came galloping on their mounts, brandishing their swords at us. It was the second wave, and while Sonnet was still acting like a beacon, illuminating us and making us courageous, we knew we had our limits too. Against the soldiers, maybe we stood a chance. But with the tree runners, it would be foolish to continue this tirade. But Sonnet was still pushing forward, the hordes of rebels still surrounding him and fighting against the Emperor's men. Silently, I saluted the chief. I now understand why he became the leader in the first place. His power probably had something to do with pushing people to be courageous. It was something that far extends beyond one's skill. It was a power fit for battle. But while everyone else was fighting, it happened so suddenly. A tree runner finally came close enough to Sonnet. Rebels pounded and struggled to stop it, using their swords, but the tree runner paid no mind. He kept pushing forward until he was right in front of Sonnet. It only took him a moment to stretch out his hand and strike at the chief. No! I shouted. Not Sonnet. Not him. But Sonnet's body floated in the air, and even though it had not hit the ground yet, I knew that the strength by which he was struck had rendered him lifeless. How did I know? My heart was suddenly filled with terror of my impending demise. Sonnet's body fell to the ground, and as though some magic defense had broken, the rebels surrounding Sonnet fell into a frenzy, thrusting swords randomly at the soldiers. One by one, they fell, as the soldiers fought them back with renewed energy. Wails and the sickening sound of flesh being gutted filled the air. Do not be disheartened. Keep fighting. I shouted. And with that, I ran towards the enemies while gripping my sword tightly with both hands. I swung against the first soldier I came across. The soldier I was fighting with was younger than I am, much stronger, and definitely swifter, but I could not afford to falter now. He swung against me. I could not block it in time. The edge of his sword grazed my arm, making me lose my balance. I fell on my back. The soldier then lunged toward me, but I kicked him hard. He fell back but was quick to rise, and in a moment, he was right above me, arms raised and sword about to swing at me. I held my breath, convinced that my death was about to take me. To my surprise, a person appeared right beside the soldier, and he swung a sword against him. The soldier fell to the ground. Before I could react, the body that wielded the sword vanished in thin air. My mouth hung open in amazement. I looked all around me, and everywhere, I could see the bodies appearing in and out, fighting against the Emperor's men. A new flash of hope surged inside my chest. There will be fighting until the end, I told myself. Sonnet was lost to the war, and so was Maurice. However, the rebels who remained needed someone to look up to. Fight. Until the end, we must fight. I shouted again. The ghosts were fighting alongside us now, and if I was not mistaken, the Emperor's men were the ones who seemed to be wavering now. Ion Noto. General, we must retreat. Lu said. He was panting. I looked at him and could not understand what he meant. I moved away from the battlefield an hour ago. It was just a matter of time before the enemies were butchered by the tree runners. What do you mean? There's no way we could lose, I said. The Grey Men, General. You were right. They're here. The rebels' leader is dead, but the enemies won't be retreating, now that they've found a new ally. I could not believe what Lu had just told me, so I quickly straddled my horse and galloped closer to the battlefield. True enough, Grey Men were fighting about. 1 or 2 tree runners had already fallen. What the cratty hell is happening? I yelled. This confirms it. The Grey Men and ghosts are one. I said, seething. Cheaters. A bunch of cheaters. That's what they are. Call back our troops. We must leave this place. We would lose a lot of our men to this treachery. We must send word to the Emperor. Lu nodded before hurriedly going back to the battlefield. I watched in horror as yet again, the Grey Men cheated on me. Twice now. It was time to use a different strategy. Elder Mayandilo. There was no need for me to request the assistance of my friends as the Emperor's men, including the tree runners, retreated from the battlefield. They rode away without looking back. The tree runners were slow in fleeing, but for some reason, the Nivens did not bother to go after them. I remembered Salvatore telling me that tree runners could sense the Nivens' presence because they had some kinship. Perhaps, it was the reason why the tree runners could run away even at a slow pace. The sounds of hooves faded in the distance. I looked around me and found Laren several yards away, tending to those who were hurt. Salvatore was on a bay, surveying what became of the land. Relief flooded everyone's faces, but it was not just that. It was a mixture of sadness, loss, and relief all at once. A few wails permeated the air, delayed cries of despair, while at random moments, I also caught the sounds of what I could mistake for jubilation. Dead men piled on the ground. Some were missing body parts, while others simply lay there as though they were sleeping. Unmoving, their faces almost looked solemn. There was no distinction among the men in death. Nivens lay beside the Emperor's men and the rebels. All victims of the war. They were gone too soon from Akea. Elder, someone broke the din. I looked up to find a rebel before me. He was old like me, but where my body lacked muscles, he was defined by them. He had fought in this war and survived. It spoke highly about his skills. I stood up to face him. My men have nowhere to go. We lost our leader. He died in the battle, but I would like to believe he had served his purpose. He is dead now because he didn't want to surrender to the Emperor's men. He paused. I am Jor Pasap. As of now, I am taking the leadership of the rebels. We fought against the Emperor's men together, and the ghosts. He paused, uncertain of his own words. His eyebrows were knitted in confusion. The ghosts fought alongside us. If your group would take us, we would like to join you. Rally us to the north, and we will follow. Order us to the south, and we will heed. We will submit to your leadership if we share the same plight. We believe we are both unsettled. Unrest echoes in our hearts, and we desire to put an end to the Emperor's rule. He has been a tyrant for too long. I fear he will never stop if we do not stop him. He looked behind me, and I followed his gaze. Laren and Salvatore were now standing beside me. I am not the leader of this group, I said. Then, I turned towards Salvatore. Do not think that just because we fought with you, we are allies, Salvatore said. Ghosts, you call us? We are not that. We are Nivens, long thought to be gone. Before today, we fought a war in Sinista, an effort to keep our identities secret. We have also fought a war in the Kanelan Palace. We thought that even then, we were still able to keep our identities secret, but I guess we cannot assume that anymore. The time for fighting has come. It is our war as much as it is yours. You may ride with us, but it doesn't mean we would not be watching you. Betrayal from your troop would mean death. I warn you, in this war, it is better to have more friends than enemies, Salvatore said. Why did you turn us away when we sought your help? We were looking for refuge, yet you turned us away, Jor said. We wanted to keep our identities hidden. It was our last attempt to avoid the war. We stand ready to fight, but if peace was still an option, we will choose peace over war. But this war, Salvatore said, looking around, this awakened us. We may be able to save our clan, but Akea is crying to be saved. And so, we heed her wails. Jor stared at Salvatore, carefully considering what the chief hunter had said. After a while, he offered a hand. Salvatore took the hand and shook it. An alliance to fight this war, though temporary, is still an alliance. No Nivan will touch you. No rebel must touch us too. This war brings us together, but once the war ends, we too must go our separate ways, Salvatore said. Jor nodded. Nothing left to be said. I am grateful that there will be no bloodshed between us. You have my word. Then, he let go of Salvatore's hand, nodded curtly at us, and turned to walk towards the band of rebels. They lost more men than the Nivens, more men than what the Emperor's group lost. We'll send them our healer, Laren said. If they will help us fight, that's the least we can do. If they had not started the fight with the Emperor's men, the soldiers would still be hounding Nivadan, looking for what they call us, grey men? Laren said wonderingly. Yes, I think that was it, she said, pausing. And so, we must help the rebels in any way we can. Salvatore nodded. Elder, we must plan, he told me. My heart was heavy with the loss of so many men, but such was the way of war. We must plan how to lessen the deaths and achieve what we want. With that thought, I followed Laren and Salvatore to the town hall. I raised a hand and rubbed at the corners of my eyes. I had not realized that I had started to cry.